Nature isn't just out there in some far-off exotic location. It's all around us, including right outside our doors. Hi, my name is Shannon Trimboli, and I am the host of Backyard Ecology. I invite you to join us as we ignite our curiosity and natural wonder, explore our yards and communities, and improve our local pollinator and wildlife habitat. Hi, everyone. Today we are talking with Dr. Adam Baker. He is a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Kentucky. He also recently accepted a position with the Davy Tree Company as their technical regional advisor. Hi, Adam. Welcome to Backyard Ecology, and thank you for talking with us today.
Hey, Shannon. Thanks for having me.
I think we met about 2 years ago at a stakeholders meeting for the Kentucky Pollinator Working Group. And at that meeting, you were sharing some of your research that you were doing on Monarch Waystations. And I thought that research sounded really, really interesting. And I was actually surprised that some of those questions hadn't been asked already, especially with how interested people are in Monarch Waystations and gardening for butterflies, pollinator gardening in general, and all that good stuff. So that's why I wanted to have you come on and share some of your research. Since we've met, I believe you've completed your PhD. Congratulations. And also published several research papers, kind of summarizing and talking about your research. But before we get started, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you're doing now?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, we had met at one of the pollinator stakeholder groups, and certainly monarch conservation has moved a long way and really got ahead of itself without ever asking some of the important ecological questions. And that's kind of what I noticed as I came in. I originally hail from Southwest Michigan, and I came down this way to pursue an environmental journalism degree. I was really into nature writing, people like Wendell Berry and Eric Rees and Gurney Norman and the sorts. So that was really my passion as I came in here as an undergraduate in Kentucky, because the University of Kentucky has just produced so many of these great writers in this field. And then I started working in some entomology labs, first in the forest entomology lab at UK, and then in the turf grass and horticultural entomology laboratory, which is where I ended up getting my graduate position. So I came at science with a little more of a creative perspective than a more traditional scientist would be. And I immediately noticed these sort of problems with monarch conservation. You know, we're spending so much money, we have so many initiatives, and yet we don't understand the basic biology of the monarch. We don't really understand its ecology and behavior, and we can certainly use all that information in our toolbox for creating conservation spaces that are going to be optimal for their findability for monarchs as well as their colonization. And that's just going to lead to a more rewarding experience for anybody that's going to be involved in this. But certainly there's things we can use to help improve these gardens.
Great, thanks. When you came and got started kind of doing that switch over from your journalism and the creative writing and everything to looking more at the entomology and into the sciences, was it the monarchs that really got you, or was it just in general being interested in the sciences and the insects and the entomology and started asking those questions and got curious and just kind of spread into that?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, even Wendell Berry mistakes dragonflies and damselflies in some of his iconic works, and getting interested. I've always been interested in nature, and spent a lot of time trudging through the dunes and the bogs and all the interesting ecosystems up in Michigan as a child. And I thought it would be productive to get some actual scientific perspective. And the monarch butterfly is a perfect organism to work on that, because it has such an applied side to it. It's not like I'm doing RNAi interference sort of work or anything like that. This has a really close to home and applied and an actionable science that people can actually use. So the monarch butterfly was perfect for me because I can both do things that are scientifically valid, but also create literature that's going to be able to be absorbed by people like master gardeners, people in the landscape industry, the horticultural industry, nurseries and stuff like that. Certainly, some of this work has influenced the way that Ohio, for example, is redoing their roadway best management practices. And certainly some of the research I've done has been incorporated into their plan, as well as the Kentucky pollinator state plans. And, we reach out to a lot of different stakeholders, including golf courses, arboreta and other areas, master gardeners as well.
Yeah. And you touched on something there that was really the reason why I wanted to have you as a guest here, is because your research is so applied, and it's something that there's so much that came out of your research that anybody who has a pollinator garden, a monarch way station, or is just interested in kind of attracting butterflies and especially monarchs, and it's that applicable real world science that we can all use. So can you tell us some about your research?
Certainly. So a lot of the work that's being done for monarch butterflies is concentrated in the Midwest, these agriculturally dominated landscapes. They're looking at reserve farmlands, roadsides, areas like that that are important for monarch breeding. But this monarch waystation idea was interesting to me because it brought nature into the urban environments. It not only is a practice that brings people together, it also brings them closer to nature. It creates networks of habitat patches that connect more natural areas. So the first thing I wanted to know, does a monarch even actually use a monarch waystation? Are these little 10 by 10 plots even significant enough for them to find and utilize? So the first thing we did was to locate these 22 monarch waystations that I chose that had sort of a similar collection of plants. And every other week for the entire summer, I would visit all of these monarch waystations in Lexington and Berea and Richmond and other areas. And I would search every single milkweed in the garden to look for the eggs and larvae of the monarch. And I quickly became to realize that certain things were encouraging the findability and use by monarchs, whereas other things were detrimental. And we wanted to look farther into that. So we looked within the garden itself. First, we wanted to know, how many plants are in the garden, how many of those are milkweeds versus nectar plants. We want to know how big the gardens were. There were two types of gardens that I would notice, one of them being a more structured garden or a more formal garden where the plants all had space around them. They were set off by mulch. They had all the elbow room they needed, which would make the plants more apparent and accessible for monarchs. Whereas other types of gardens had more of this feral or like prairie aesthetic where everything was in this plant competition sort of strategy. So we looked at that, and then we also looked at the landscapes surrounding the monarch waystations. We looked at a 100-meter buffer zone, and what we wanted to know was if a monarch approaching a garden from 100 meters away, what's the likelihood of it finding the actual garden? Can it orient to the garden, or is there many structures obstructing its view? Is there a lot of impenetrable surfaces that may be influencing water runoff and maybe increasing those heat island effects that we see in cities? And after doing all of this work, we found two important things. The first being within the garden itself, the most important thing that you can do to attract monarchs to lay eggs in your garden is to have plants isolated from one another. To have them maintain a strong visual silhouette. So monarchs are likely using visual cues to find their host plants until they get rather close to them, which they then may switch to olfactory cues. And so if you isolate your plants, you're going to simplify the system. You're going to make the plants very apparent and very visually accessible from head to toe. Whereas a milkweed in competition may only be accessible for the top third. It's not very likely that a monarch is going to fly deep into plants overlapping each other where praying mantis and spiders could be waiting to prey upon them. And also it's going to reduce that visibility and those visual cues for monarchs. And as far as the landscape factors that were concerned, even in very urban areas, we did find a lot of monarchs, but the two most important things really were the plants isolated and whether or not a monarch waystation maintained a clear line of sight to the north and south. Basically what that tells us, if you have the option to plant either on the east-west side of your house or the north-south side of your house, it may be better to plant on the east and west to maintain that north-south line. One of the waystations we looked at was at one of the utilities buildings down in Berea, and it had a gigantic warehouse on the west side of it, where a monarch would never be able to approach it from that entire west side, but that had a very open and clear space on the north south, and it was a very, very productive way station. They also had that plant spacing employed in there. So yeah, use the landscape that you have. Use natural flyways, things like roadways, and the way that the canopies are set up, or if you live in a valley, because insects as well as birds and other flying animals are going to take the path of least resistance. So if you can use those natural lines in the landscape and place your garden in a place that's likely going to, bring in those flying animals, that's a good place to start.
And when you talk about isolation, how isolated is isolated? Are you talking about feet between them, or can you give us an idea of how isolated the vegetation needs to be? Because I'm always one of the ones that I have the wild, let's throw everything together, let it compete type gardens. That's what I tend to do. And then also, you were talking about having those lines of sight. How far away from the buildings do they need to be able to have those good lines of sight?
Yeah, so the way I think about plant isolation is that you don't want any other plants to be interacting or touching the milkweed itself. But you don't have to go just fully that way. You can also incorporate the competition gardens. You can incorporate clusters of milkweed, but you should have a little bit of everything to maintain that. There's previous research that was done in Australia and very fundamental work on monarchs, where they looked at the likelihood of where eggs are going to be placed throughout giant patches of common milkweed. And most likely, female monarchs are going to be using the edge of those plantings, and they're going to be using isolated plants that are off to the edge. They're not very likely to lay eggs in the very center of a large milkweed patch. And we see this too if you've ever gone out to one of these large milkweed fields. You'll see the males surveying these areas. You'll even see them fly up and attack red-winged blackbirds on the wing to make sure that their territory is known. So as soon as a female monarch flies into those areas, those male monarchs are on her immediately. They're harassing her. She's probably not going to have a whole lot of nectaring there, and she will not really have enough time to sit there and lay eggs without having to deal with male monarchs. So smaller patch size is going to facilitate less of that monitoring by the males. That's why these way stations can be rather productive, because generally they're not huge patches of milkweed like you would see in a field. So that has a little bit to do with it. So generally a couple feet, a meter or so could be great to have some plants, but you don't have to go just one way. You could mix it up. You could even throw in some potted milkweeds around or near the garden, especially if you set them out in managed turf grass or other low-lying vegetation to get that strong silhouette. And as far as how close to a building, it doesn't really matter. It can be very close to a building. The most important thing is that you maintain that north-south line of sight. And really the only bad thing is when you lose those north-south line of sights, or it's completely blocked off. For instance, one of the way stations that we looked at was at a retirement home, and it was in a courtyard with about 20-foot high walls on all sides. So the only way a monarch could ever find it is if it flew directly overhead from a bird's eye view and stumbled upon the garden. And as you can expect, I did not find a single monarch in that garden throughout the entire year.
And I'm assuming the north-south line of sight is really to attract the migrating monarchs versus ones that might already be in the area and could be coming from any direction and would know that the milkweed's there.
Well, I mean, these are not migrating monarchs that we were looking at, because the migrators are going to be in reproductive diapause and they're not going to be laying eggs in your gardens. But whatever functionality they're using for orientation seems to be playing a factor in this. Maybe whatever astrological signs that they're using, or magnetism and whatnot that they're using, is going to is somehow influencing it. This is a 1-year study, and this was done in actual citizen science created gardens. So none of these things are definite. They're not like the replicated studies that we will be talking about later, but these just give us a glimpse of what's going on in real world gardens, and can give us an idea of what to work with. And of all the things we looked at about 40 different factors. We ran it through this very complex multivariate analysis. And the only two things that came out important, like I said, was the plant spacing and then this north-south line of sight.
Interesting. It's always cool how much you can learn when we look at these different things. Because, yeah, I'm curious now to know what they're using the queue on even during the breeding season when they're not migrating to still get that north-south axis. Now, if somebody's setting up a brand new pollinator garden and is just wanting to get started with it, any suggestions on the best way to design it? Like, where do you place the milkweeds? Which species, cultivars, anything like that?
Certainly. So after this Monarch Waystation survey, we wanted to take our own stab at designing our gardens. So what we did was we created 5 replicates or 15 gardens with 3 different designs. We took all of these and put them on a farm here in Lexington, where I set all of the gardens on an east-west transect, about 300 meters, so 100 meters between each garden. And then there were about at least 300 meters away from any other replicate. So the idea is here is we could catch that north-south flight without having the gardens interact with each other on that east-west gradient. And then we created 3 designs, and there is a lot known about the way that butterflies find their host plants, not necessarily the monarch at this point, but we wanted to look at some of that. And we also looked at sustainable agriculture to get some clues and some ideas on how to improve our gardens. So in sustainable agriculture, our goal is to stop specialist insects from colonizing our crops and devouring them. And we do this in many ways, and some of the more natural ways, one of them being the polyculture plantings, which are essentially create this very confusing visual mosaic of unrelated plants. And what this does is it is going to increase the complexity of those systems. So those visual cues are going to be harder to pick up on. And also it can lead to things like inappropriate landings. So if the butterfly starts to pick up on its host plant, it goes into the area, it could accidentally land on an unrelated plant very nearby. It starts tasting it with its little feelers on its forelegs, and then it gets duped and it says, well, this isn't the plant I thought it was, and it may just leave the system. Also, there's some other work done by Richard Root that highly influenced this work, looking at the concentration of resources, as well as how that concentration influences the natural enemies in the area. So, like I said, we designed 3 of our own gardens. Our first garden had all of our milkweed plants along the perimeter of the garden. They were set off by mulch, and they all had enough space that they were not interacting with any other plants. And then we put a collection of ornamental grasses, as well as tall flowering plants, such as Tithonia torch, zinnias, things of that nature in the middle. In our second design, we took the same number of plants, except we inversed the design. We essentially built a wall of flowers and grasses surrounding the milkweed in the middle, which is once again set up by mulch. And this basically created a visual barrier as well as a chemical barrier that would mask the milkweed inside. And our final design was more of that natural approach, where we cut the garden into quadrants. We put all those plants at all of them interacting with each other and mixed in. Very natural looking, but very confusing for a butterfly, because we want these gardens to be as easy to find as possible. So we ran this experiment for 2 years. So every other week, I would go out, I'd count all of the eggs and larvae on all of the gardens. And overwhelmingly, in both years, we saw a lot more eggs and larvae in the gardens with the perimeter milkweeds. It's with the milkweeds that are most apparent and most accessible to the butterflies. Although we did notice that there was about equal numbers of adult monarchs foraging in the gardens. So they are still finding the gardens, but maybe as they approach them, if that milkweed is right in the forefront, they go straight into that sort of egg-laying behavior. Whereas if they encounter large flowers, they may be going into a nectaring and foraging behavior. So in the first year, we had 2.5 times more monarchs in our perimeter gardens than we did the mixed or the interior gardens, which both behaved very similar. And in the second year, we actually had 4 times more monarchs in the perimeter gardens than the mixed or the interior gardens. Now, to verify that this had something to do with the findability that's leading to this colonization, we also look at all the predators in the garden. So at every time I would check these gardens, I record every single predator that was on the plants that could interact with monarchs, things like ants and spiders and predatory stink bugs and assassin bugs, wasps and things like that. And then we also compared all the ground dwelling predators that could interact with monarchs as they moved from plant to plant or to pupation sites. And we found absolutely no difference between all three of the garden types, verifying that the design itself is influencing the colonization, not something else like the natural enemy abundance with things like spiders and other predators.
Very cool. And that's nice too, because if you've got a garden already established, if putting the milkweeds on the outside is the most useful for getting more monarchs to lay their eggs and stuff, that means you don't have to dig up the center to put the tall plants in the middle like you're taught for any gardening thing. But it sounds like you can even just add on by putting, if you didn't want to surround everything, just put on two little wings or a wing on one side or something like that of your taller milkweed, and that would actually benefit for the monarchs too.
Yeah, I mean, certainly there's certain milkweeds that you can use that are going to adhere to your designs. They're not going to be spreading, via rhizomes and invading your neighbor's lawn. So you can certainly still get, a more formal and designed garden using these ideas. You could, create, wings on the side. You could also use some maybe shorter statured milkweeds and put those up front to still have that. And then you can put some of the taller milkweeds in back. Once again, if we're getting them into that egg laying behavior and they're picking up on those cues, you can have multiple species of milkweed helping you achieve those goals.
And are all species of milkweeds equal? Because I know you did some research on that as well.
Yeah, so we did once again another like 2-year study where we created a bunch of replicated gardens. We put these in high visible areas at our local arboretum, and we compared 8 species of milkweed. We looked at the common milkweed, the swamp milkweed, the butterfly milkweed, the world milkweed, the green milkweed, and then a couple western species, the narrowleaf, the broadleaf, and the showy milkweed. And we essentially created all these gardens, and we wanted to know a few things. We wanted to know first which milkweed would attract the most eggs and larvae. And we wanted to know, are all species equal as far as nutrition is concerned? And then we also wanted to know, being as these milkweeds are so diverse in both their flower form and color, are they being used by different communities of bees? So once again, I would go out and I'd look at all these gardens every other week for 2 full years and count all the numbers of eggs and larvae. And what we found in that was pretty interesting. In the first year, the swamp milkweed, the Asclepias incarnata, was the most attractive to monarchs, followed by the common milkweed and then the showy milkweed. Now, these are all the tallest broadleaf milkweeds that we have in our group. And in that first year, they all maxed out at about 3.5 feet. The swamp milkweed, of course, bloomed that first year, and the common and the showy did not, because they were investing some energy downstairs in the root system so they could get a little more British next year. So in the second season, once again, the swamp milkweed maxed out at about 3.5 feet, whereas the common and the showy milkweed maxed out about 5 to 6 feet. And in that year, the preferences of the monarchs changed. Now the showy milkweed was the most attractive, followed by the common, and then the swamp milkweed. So certainly there's some visual cues going on there that are influencing the colonization by monarchs. Now, to compare the suitability of nutritionally for the milkweeds, on several different occasions, we would cage monarch larvae onto branches of the milkweed, allow them to feed until they were reaching one of their later larval stages, which there is 5. And at that point, we would collect all the monarchs. We would measure the weight that they had gained from when they got on the plant till now, as well as the larval instar that they achieved. We did this both in the field and in the greenhouse. We could remove all those uncontrollable abiotic factors, and we didn't detect any difference in any of the milkweeds in either trial. So what's interesting is a tuberosa or a butterfly milkweed is just as viable nutritionally, although we rarely ever found an egg or caterpillar on it. So there's something going on there. The tall broadleaf plants are attracting the eggs, but these other species are viable. Now, what this tells me is, as a gardener, is that you can use multiple species in your garden, because some of the more attractive ones are going to be eaten by the caterpillars first. And then if you have other less attractive ones, those can be more valuable later in the season after some of the more attractive ones have already senesced. And as far as the bees were concerned, it was really interesting as the flower form was certainly influencing the types of bees that visited the milkweeds. If your goal is to encourage large bees like bumblebees or honeybees or carpenter bees, or if you have an apiary on your property, the swamp, the common, and the showy milkweed were all very good for those large bees because they had a large flower form that could facilitate the large mouth parts of the bees. The butterfly milkweed actually attracted the greatest number of bees out of any of the species. It's very nectar rich, and it also had a lot of diversity on there. A lot of the native bees, the mason bees and leafcutter bees and sweat bees were all attracted to the butterfly milkweed. But surprisingly, the world milkweed actually had the greatest diversity of any of the bee communities. Although it has a pretty small flower form, we would actually see bumblebees nectar robbing, where they would actually get on the flower from the bottom side, cut open the nectary, and steal the nectar that way. But also, we found a lot of diversity of really small sweat bees and some of the mason bees that were attracted to this one, although not in great numbers, but greatest diversity.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I know in my own gardens, I've got common milkweed, and then I've also got butterfly milkweed. And during the early part of the year, I only see the monarch caterpillars and stuff on the common milkweed. But then by the late summer, early fall, that's starting to kind of die down. The leaves are starting, the vegetation's starting to get old and not as nice anymore. And that's when I will start finding all the monarch caterpillars on my butterfly milkweed. As I usually don't find them on there until August.
That's exactly what I saw. Very early season or very late season is where you see, especially on the butterfly milkweed, for example, all the numbers that I counted on ours mostly came from those two time periods. Whereas during the prime time of the season, those tall milkweeds are going to be the attractive ones. But yeah, I mean, this just shows that having multiple species of milkweed is going to be beneficial to both the monarchs and the bees. As a ecological gardener and a conservation gardener, the more good that we can do for the more species, the better. That's one thing that's interesting about the monarch butterfly, which is one of the questions I had when I started working on it. What the heck good is a monarch butterfly anyways? Why are people so crazy about this butterfly? If we look at it from a pollination standpoint, it's not a very effective pollinator, especially when we compare that to things like bees, especially the large bees with the hairy bodies and pollen baskets. But we can use the monarch as an umbrella species to encourage the conservation of other species. It's a pretty tough sell to say, go plant this plant so we can attract parasitic wasps and stinging insects. But if you say, hey, you're going to attract beautiful butterflies, it's a lot easier to get people on board to get some of these native plants and pollinator beneficial plants out there.
I completely agree. Yeah, I'm the same way. The butterflies are pretty and stuff, but the bees and everything else can be so fascinating and interesting in their own right. And then just to be able to see all those, and just without even doing the study, just observationally, I've noticed too that, like you said, there's a difference between the bees that I see on the common milkweed and the larger milkweeds versus on the butterfly milkweed and the smaller flowered ones. So it's interesting to see the science behind it as well, backing it up, and that it's not just what I happen to be seeing on my plants in my garden, this very small area.
And that's why the replication is so important. A lot of people, I'm part of several, Facebook groups for monarchs, and, sometimes you have to tread lightly when you come in here with some science that you've done, because if it doesn't fit in with the ideology of what someone saw in their 3-foot patch in their backyard, they get insulted. And that's not what we're trying to do as scientists. We're trying to create the most useful information as possible. We spend countless hours and to make this research happen. So that's why that replication is so important, because what's happening in your backyard, if you go on the opposite side of Lexington, it could be a totally different story. Microclimates and other things are going to influence that. So, but yeah, every year as well, since I started working on the Monarch, it's been pretty interesting is the availability of the types of milkweeds that you can get. First it was just, the swamp, the common, and the butterfly milkweed was pretty much the only thing you could get. Now there's many species on the market that are being, sold as seeds or cuttings. The purple milkweed, for example, has just gone wild, where people are paying, upwards of $3 for a single seed of this very finicky milkweed that likes a very, micro habitat. Um, and also the cultivation of milkweeds is really taking off, where people are selecting for either a floral display or flower color, even some variegated varieties in the tropical milkweed. Of course, this is going to be great for the horticultural industry because they thrive on variety and they thrive on having plants that are going to have predictable aesthetics as well as statures, so people can incorporate them into their gardens in a meaningful way. So we can talk a little bit about that research now, if you'd like.
Yeah, that'd be awesome, because going into the cultivars and stuff, that's something that I know so many people are talking about now. Cultivars versus the native wild types and the differences between them. And I know there's people are concerned about genetics and diluting the genetics of wild types, which it can be a concern when you're out, like where I am in a rural area where there are the possibility of having lots of natural wild type species there. But in an urban area or suburban area, that's not as much of a concern. And the genetic dilution wouldn't be as much of a concern because you don't have local wild types right there either to dilute the genes of.
Right. So yeah, there's a couple issues that very strict native plant enthusiasts have with cultivars, and one of them is that they can dilute, like you said, some natural populations. But really, I mean, that's probably not going to be a very big concern because you're not likely going to have 1,000 plants of one cultivar planted in an area that's going to influence the population genetics in your area. There is a concern that it reduces genetic variability amongst areas. A perfect example of this is, trees that have been selected for certain, let's say, characteristics. They can, handle compact soil, or they're insect resistant, or they have a really great fall color. And then they plant the entire street with all the exact same genetically identical tree. And then if something comes in that tree is susceptible to, things like Dutch elm disease, things like the emerald ash borer, and they could essentially wipe out these entire neighborhoods of trees. Whereas, a milkweed is probably not going to be in the same sort of realm as that. And also, there's a concern of whether or not these plants are actually viable as host plants. So the science of looking at the herbivore and cultivar interaction is very new. There's only very few studies published on this. And in examples where we're selecting for a red leaf color over a green leaf color, that does influence the carbon and nitrogen ratios and put some other toxins in there that can actually be detrimental to herbivores. So we wanted to look at this question, and of course, this is a perfect question to test on monarch butterflies and their host plant. So what we did is we wanted to compare our native wild-type milkweeds with several of their cultivars. So we chose two species. We got the swamp milkweed, or the Asclepias incarnata, and we compared the wild type with three of its cultivars: the Cinderella, the Soulmate, and the Ice Ballet. Now, the Cinderella is selecting, I think, for larger flower clusters. The Soulmate is selecting for more flower clusters, and the Ice Ballet is actually a white form compared to the more purple form of the milkweed, and also has a lighter leaf color as well. And then we also took a group from tuberosa, or the butterfly milkweed, where we compared the wild type to three of its cultivars: the Hello Yellow, which of course has a bright yellow flower compared to the orange flower it usually has; the Gay Butterflies, which can have several different phenotypes expressed from red to orange to yellow on the same plant; And then the blonde bombshell, which much like the hello yellow, but a little more of a subdued sort of creamy yellow rather than that bright neon yellow. So very similar to our species comparison, we created replicated gardens. We put them at the Arboretum so people could interact with them and learn from them and enjoy them, and while we are also doing science on them. And very similar to that study, we wanted to compare colonization over a 2-year period. We wanted to compare the nutritional value of all of these, because if we're selecting for traits in plants, sometimes there's some unintentional linkages that can happen, which can create greater defensive characteristics of a plant. And then we wanted to look at, once again, the bee communities, because if we're messing with flower genetics, we expect to have differences in the bees as well. So as far as colonization was concerned, from the species level, of course, we found a lot more butterflies or caterpillars and eggs on the swamp milkweed group than we did the tuberosa group. But we did not detect any difference in colonization between the cultivars and their respective wild types in either group. Then we looked at the defensive characteristics. So first thing we wanted to know is if you've ever ripped up a milkweed leaf, you've seen the milky sap come out. So we wanted to compare the amount of sap that would be exuded from a damaged leaf. We did this by cutting off tips of the leaves, collecting all that latex for a certain amount of time, and then comparing the weights. Now, we did find that some of the cultivars had more latex, statistically more latex than the wild type. Next, we looked at the trichome density, which are these little hairs that act as a sort of a mechanical barrier for small crawling insects. And once again, we did pick up on some differences where some of the cultivars had a greater number of trichomes than the respective wild types. And then we also looked at the cardinalides within the plants themselves, which is the toxin that the butterflies actually sequester in their own body and use for their own defense. And once again, we did find that some of the cultivars had a little bit higher rates, and especially in the swamp milkweed group, than their respective wild types. But if we compare overall density from the two groups, we're looking at somewhere around 100 parts per billion in the swamp milkweeds, whereas we're looking at more like 1,500 in the butterfly milkweeds. So small differences, magnitudes lower, are not going to have any effect. So yeah, we did pick up some differences in defensive characteristics, but when we looked at the nutritional quality of all of the milkweeds by, once again, caging the caterpillars on different types of milkweeds, allowing them to feed and comparing their growth and developmental stages, we found no differences compared to the respective wild types. So even though there is some slight change in the defensive characteristics of plants, they're not severe enough to be influencing either colonization or growth and development of the larvae. So basically, all of these milkweeds are going to be safe for our monarchs, and they're also going to be suitable host plants, just as suitable as the wild types. But when it came to bees, the cultivars were better because we're selecting for more flowers, we're selecting for greater flower size, and so as you'd expect, a greater pollinator resource is going to attract more bees. And then actually, some of the cultivars attracted different communities of bees, which is rather interesting. So in one example, the butterfly milkweed group, the wild type, attracted a very diverse community, like we expected from our previous study. But the blonde bombshell almost exclusively was supporting one genus of sweat bee, the Lasioglossum. Out of everything that we collected off of these, is almost all came out of one genus, which is one of the small sweat bees, which is a very interesting interaction because these plants are not that far from each other. So the bee has a choice to visit any of these plants, but for some reason, there's just higher densities on certain plants.
Any idea why? Or
we don't know the whys on that one necessarily, but it could be something to do with the form and function of the depth of the nectaries. It could be something to do with insects are capable of learning, and if this type of insect is selecting for a yellow flower color, it could be just more attracted to that. So there's a number of reasons that could be influencing it, but that was, sort of beyond our scope at that point.
Yes. Yeah, you can only do so much in any one study. But yeah, I find that interesting too, because my understanding is that part of the way the bee visual system works is that they also see contrast between things. So just as a general rule, when I'm looking at and thinking about cultivars versus wild type, I get a lot more nervous about using cultivars that have changed the color of the flowers or the leaves because of that possibility of changing the contrast values. But you were saying that in your study, the yellow butterfly milkweed was in many ways almost more attractive for at least than the orange wild type, at least for the varieties that you looked at.
Well, in the swamp milkweed group, some of the cultivars were more attractive. The soulmate, for example, has way more flower clusters than the wild type did. We found a lot more bees on there. But what's interesting in the butterfly group is that we actually saw a reduction in diversity from the wild type to one of the yellow types. But then we did not get a difference in the other two types, even though one of them was also yellow. So something is going on with the blonde bombshell, where it's supporting almost exclusively one type of bee, whereas all the other ones are interacting pretty much equally with very diverse groups of bees. So I guess if if you really wanted to support a very specific type of bee, that might be good for you. It was just interesting to see that difference, even though we did have two yellow flowered butterfly milkweeds in the same group, and found two very different communities on either of them, and then also that one community differing from the wild type milkweed.
Interesting. Looks like there's, as with everything else, there's never a one single answer. It kind of varies and it depends. I mean, in all my ecology and wildlife biology classes, that was always the most popular answer. And I find myself giving it a lot more often now myself too, when people ask me questions about things.
Certainly at this point, cultivars and my perspective on them, it's a case by case basis. We don't have a whole lot of information on these interactions. It looks like these milkweeds in these groups are going to be just as functional as a host plant as their wild types, but we don't know a whole lot about that interaction.
I know you looked at some work on some of the pests and predators as well. And butterfly houses, I've always heard and read, yeah, they really don't do any good. There's no research showing that or evidence that they're being used by butterflies to hibernate in or to spend the night in or anything like that. But most everything I've always read and heard is like, if you really want to put one out for decorative purposes, go ahead, no big deal, doesn't hurt anything. But some of your research showed that that might not be so true, if I understood it correctly.
Yeah, so just to define butterfly houses for those that aren't familiar with them, they're essentially similar to a birdhouse. They're used to add visual interest to your gardens. They're these tall, slim boxes with slits in them where butterflies can enter. You can paint them cool colors and whatnot. And the idea is, like you said, for butterflies to either weather storms or to hibernate in and to get away from the elements. I certainly have never seen a butterfly enter one of these butterfly houses, nor anybody I know has ever seen one, but certainly they create a perfect habitat for a caterpillar hunting specialist, as in paper wasps. And essentially, if we're trying to create spaces that are going to be conservation areas for butterflies, we do not want to put optimal habitat of caterpillar hunting wasps inside our gardens. There's a series of pollinator gardens on campus that I went and looked at. There's a total of 19 butterfly boxes across campus. Once again, all in pollinator gardens with these big signs that say no spraying, no mowing. This is a conservation area. The only problem is 16 out of those 19 boxes were all filled with paper wasps, which are then descending upon the gardens and essentially creating ecological traps for monarchs, because they're attracted in, they're laying their eggs, and then all of their larvae are being scooped up by these wasps. So the main wasp here that was the problem was the European paper wasp. So this is an invasive wasp that has essentially followed humans across across the world. They're almost on every continent. And what their strategy is to make their nesting sites in human-made structures. They love to get under eaves and soffits, and they love to get into tight spaces and garages and other areas. Wherever they can find an interesting place that's going to be protected from the elements, they like to make their nests there. And this wasp, of course, pretty much exclusively feeds its young on soft-bodied insects, caterpillars and specifically. And as I was doing previous research, I had noticed this wasp hunting monarch caterpillars. We think of monarch caterpillars as chemically defended. We think, how the heck is this wasp able to overcome these defenses? And what we found was pretty cool. So this wasp has this really neat behavior where when it encounters a caterpillar and successfully preys upon it, it'll actually cut the caterpillar open, remove its entire digestive tract, and leave it behind, thus eliminating all of those toxins that are still active in the gut. And then from there, if it's a small caterpillar, it'll simply carry it off, roll it up into a ball, and carry it back to the nest. And if it's a large caterpillar, they'll actually process it into multiple manageable pieces that they can fly piece by piece back to the nest. There are also lazy wasps that will, if they encounter one of these events, they'll actually just sit back and wait for the original wasp to leave and then swoop in to pick up some of the pieces left behind. And we also saw a lot of really interesting searching behavior. We think a lot of this is going to be visual searching and not so much olfactory. We did sort of compare, by smearing stuff like caterpillar frass on plants to see if that would influence, searching by wasps, and it seemed to be mostly visual. Sometimes these caterpillars, if they encounter a wasp, they will simply drop off the plant. Some of them will drop down on silk strings. Actually, on one occasion, I saw a wasp fly up to a plant. It noticed a silk string hanging from the plant, simply followed it down, snatched the caterpillar right off the end of it. And as the caterpillars get bigger, they're a lot harder to prey upon. So we actually saw some of the last instar caterpillars, or the last developmental stage of them, is that these caterpillars would actually fight back. If a wasp encounters them, they'll start thrashing violently. They'll kind of roll up, they'll kind of do their thing, and the wasps are saying, hey, that's too much for me. I'm not going to try to tackle that. So for anybody out there who likes to bring caterpillars in and help protect them, the most good you can do is on the very young caterpillars. By the time a caterpillar is already made to its giant, when we think about monarch caterpillars, we think about the ones that are the size of your pinky. Those ones don't need any help. They're doing pretty well on their own, and they're most likely going to become an adult. But the little tiny ones that you see are the ones that are in danger more so.
Well, this has been fascinating, and I will post links of all your research and the show notes, because I'm guessing there's going to be lots of people that want to learn more about this and read more than we've been able to cover in this time. But if people want to follow your research, they can look you up on ResearchGate, Google.
You can always find everything that I've done on ResearchGate. And there's also more interpretive type stuff on there, like posters that I presented that are more applicable and easier to understand than some of the scientific literature.
Very nice. Well, thanks again for talking with us today, and hope you have a great day. Thanks a lot.
You too. Thanks.
I really appreciate Adam taking time to talk with us. His research is just another example of how much we still have to learn about gardening for pollinators and wildlife, even for something as iconic and popular as the monarch butterfly. To me, it's exciting to see more of this type of research being done, especially when it results in real-world applications that we can so easily use in our own yards and communities. Before I wrap this up, I wanted to let you know that the Backyard Ecology website has a shop where I sell my book and nature-related note cards. If you're interested, please check it out at www.backyardecology.net/shop. Proceeds from the Backyard Ecology shop help support the Backyard Ecology podcast and blog. Until next week, I encourage you to take some time to enjoy the nature in your own yards and community.